I call your attention to the slide in front of you, which has the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they are known, which we will be going over today. And this is the picture that I've selected for our cover. And today we'll be going over the chapter that introduces these characters and describes them. And I'm looking forward to it. I also want to note that I had it a bit easy this week, as one of the things that takes more time than you may realize is finding good pictures to go along with the slides. I don't know if it's my perfectionism kicking in or what, but I spent a lot of time. And this week I had it easy because I liked this picture and I just cut out the horses and I applied them to the relevant slide. And we'll get to that in a moment. I've entitled this class Seven Seals. Well, six in retrospect. The most Bible headings and subtitles will say seven seals, as in the seven seals on the scroll that the Lamb, who is Jesus, has the authority and power to and worthiness to open. But the seventh will be opened actually not even at the next lesson, at a later lesson. But first, a brief review on where we have just recently been. 2 weeks ago, we took a hard look at the fourth and fifth chapters of Revelation, and chapter 4 includes a description of the heavenly throne room. We discussed how John's vision compares to other descriptions of God's throne room from his Jewish apocalyptic traditions, such as Isaiah and Ezekiel. In those books, you can find combinations of beasts that are similar to the four beasts that we find here, only maybe instead of having one head, perhaps four faces, or instead of having six wings, maybe two, or instead of having eyes inside and out, wheels within eyes and eyes. We went over all that last week. But in Revelation, we have not exactly an amalgamation, but similar images. And furthermore, we discussed the message conveyed by the description of God's throne room. The readers would have immediately recognized that here was set a throne room scene that not only rivaled the emperor's, but made his look drab and unimpressive by comparison. Even the heavenly court is adorned in splendor in such a way that suggests that even God's attendants reflect more of God's glory than the emperor's own accoutrements do. The message being God is God and Caesar is not. And in this context, Caesar oftentimes claimed to have supreme authority only God should have. Chapter 5 begins with the introduction of a scroll sealed with seven seals. This is what we'll be picking up from. A seal sealed as a royal might seal a document of high importance with wax and a very specific mark made with perhaps a ring or some form of stamp. However, the prophet John becomes appalled and dismayed that there seems to be no one worthy to open the scroll. But then enter Jesus Christ, first as a lion, but then as a slaughtered lamb. And then the lamb, in that unassuming image of a delicate lamb, bleeding, slaughtered, but standing, takes the scroll and is so proclaimed by the heavenly host as worthy, thus signifying that the slaughtered lamb is worthy to open the scroll for the very reasons that, because he was the slaughtered lamb, because of his faithful witness, because of Jesus's faithful opposition as God's son to all of the forces of evil, and his victory over even the worst with his resurrection from his death on the cross. So the worthiness of this lamb rivals the worthiness of God on the throne. So that elevates Jesus above the emperor. Now you can imagine how Roman officials in the area might react to a letter like this, where you have a bunch of people who are calling themselves Jesus followers, with the pejorative title put on them as Christians. And they're claiming that the one they follow, who the Roman Empire thinks of as dead, is actually king above the emperor. This can be seen as insurrection talk. Where does your loyalty lie? Might be the question. Tonight, we're going to consider the messages that we are meant to receive by way of symbolic metaphor in chapter 6. The breaking of each seal on the scroll is accompanied by a miniature scene of its own. And tonight, we'll consider each of these scenes and explore what they might have meant to first century Christians in the Roman Empire. The whole while, try and see if you can find similarities to the context into which John wrote and our own. See if any of this resonates with our own situation today. So let's begin at the beginning of chapter 6. We'll go through verses 1 and 2 now. They read, "Then I saw the Lamb break one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures call out as with a voice of thunder, Come. I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. John here is commanded to come or perhaps go. Either way, he is invited or commanded to enter into the next vision. And this will be one of three visions or images that will each communicate similar points in different ways. So today we're considering the scroll and its 7 seals, but coming up we will encounter a scene with 7 trumpets and 7 bowls. I think that Dr. Brian Blount's commentary on Revelation chapters 6 through 16, so the entire middle portion of Revelation, I think that his commentary on those chapters gives us a helpful lens through which we might see this larger portion, this middle portion of the letter as we move on through subsequent weeks. He writes of these chapters, John is the master of a 3-ring narrative circus. The 7 seals in chapters 6 through 8:1, the 7 trumpets in chapters 8:2 through 11:18, and the 7 bowls in chapter 16 verses 1 through 21 stage the same preparatory build up to the last judgment. They do so, however, from different perspectives. Hearers and readers watch 3 different versions of the end time unfold simultaneously at 3 different places on the narrative set. And I think that the image of a 3-ring circus is quite apt here, where you can look out and see all 3 at once or focus on one or the other, but perhaps all 3 trying to tell us the same story in unique ways. John is first presented after the first seal has been opened by the Lamb, Jesus. The first vision is of a rider on a white horse. This is no ordinary rider. This rider is a conqueror. We know this because of the crown, would indicate that he is a conqueror and a royal. The color is also significant, as will be the case in the next 3 horses and their riders. Leonard Thompson, biblical commentator, writes in his commentary on Revelation, Revelation underscores white, probably reflecting the significance of white horses in Greco-Roman world. High-ranking officers rode white horses. One can compare this scene to the entrance of Jesus as the Lamb entering the scene on a white horse that is described in these exact same Greek words that I should add also describe a brilliant white. Think white like perhaps the transfiguration of Jesus, honestly. That's the kind of brilliant white we're meant to envision here. However, as we proceed, you will hopefully notice the important differences between these 4 riders and Jesus as he rides in chapter 19. We will talk more about that next month. But for now, the most important thing to know is that this horse is that it is the horse of a conquering king. And this is precisely who sits astride the horse. The king here has a crown that he wears on his head, indicating that he fully owns the role of conquering king, for only a king who has conquered is meant to wear a crown. So far, so good. This scene would not be unlike any number of statues erected throughout the Roman Empire of conquering generals and emperors on their horses. If you walk past a statue cut in this image, if you lived in the Roman Empire, you might not bat an eye, except for one detail we'll get to in a moment. But otherwise, this image may well have instilled even a sense of some national pride. You might have imagined your own emperor riding the horse in your name and advocacy of your safety and stability, going out and conquering other nations. But there is one important detail that would have caught the first century Romans off guard. This rider holds a bow. So what? I mean, what a bow is a weapon. Why not a sword? What's with a bow? Well, Brian Blount writes of this, according to classical historians, as fearsome as Rome was as a military power, its legendary legions never mastered the use of a bow. Archers from the ranks of client kingdoms were employed as auxiliary troops. The bow was, however, a primary weapon of several of Rome's principal enemies. In fact, it stood as a metaphor for the kingdom Rome feared the most, Parthia. The Parthians were renowned not only for their archery skills, but even more impressively, for their ability to fire their bows accurately while mounted on galloping white horses. This image is meant to convey the message to Rome. Just as you have seen yourself in the role of conqueror, the same kind of forces you've arrayed against your neighbors will come back around. In this scene, When the Lamb unseals the first scroll, he unleashes the same kind of conquering violence on Rome that it had inflicted on that entire region of the world, which, in the grand scheme of things, is what happened over a long period of time. Rome's influence waned as its conquered territories were reclaimed. I've in mind here Jesus' warning to Peter, where he said that those who live by the sword will die by the sword, a line that is nearly quoted verbatim later in Revelation chapter 13. But then comes the red horse, similar story to the white horse, but more intense. Verses 3-4 read, "When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, 'Come!' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword." Now, emphasis on bright red. Bright red indicates victory in warfare. This bright red horse is meant to be seen as the penultimate war horse, with symbolizing the most violence. And also, I should say that the only other times that this bright red are used in the book of Revelation is to describe the harlot on the beast later and the bright red dragon. So what could be implied here is that even the power of the devil here is controlled and channeled and kept there are limits put to it, because it is the Lamb who opens the seal and lets this horse go. Or it may just indicate that violence like this is as hellish as the devil. But this is the color of slaughter, which should cue us into the meaning of this second horse and its rider. And this rider who brings slaughter brings calamity and destruction to the entire world by using a great sword. That's the important key here. This great sword was, quoting Brian Blunt here, forgot to put his name in, but that's who this is. This great sword was used for swinging and cutting rather than for stabbing. It was also a symbol for imperial authority, in particular, the emperor's authority to decree the death penalty, which was called the right to the sword. So this cues the readers or the hearers of this letter that the so-called peace of Rome, or Pax Romana, as they called it, is built on a lie. Rome was peaceful for some of its citizens, but the great sword Rome wielded kept the peace by violent oppression. But now the truth is told of the great sword. It does not provide peace, but global calamity. And boy, don't we see this truth play out again and again and again, even today. Later, John declares that those who kill with the sword shall otherwise themselves be killed by the sword, which is a quote from Jesus from the Gospel of Luke. The second writer uses his weapon to set that tragic circumstance into motion. The Romans, who used the sword to create their self-interested peace, now find the sword being used to cut them down and shred their serenity to bits. The irony is eschatologically delicious. That eschatological word just means pertaining to the doctrines of the end times. And it says that it's delicious in that way because they not only receive the justice they deserve, their own symbolic tool of pitiless oppression is used to deliver it. Or, as Jesus said, those who live by the sword die by the sword. And this horse and its rider are meant to represent the violence that comes back around to pull apart the alleged, quote unquote, peace of Rome that was built on violence, which historically is what eventually happened to Rome, as I said, in piecemeal fashion. But the same factors remain. If what pertains to Rome is true of us all, if the great sword will find its way back round to wound its wielder, then all nation states that have risen to power by way of comparable military force may face a similar end, which is a sobering thought. Now we're on the third seal and the black horse. When he broke the third seal, verse 5, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hands, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage the olive oil and the wine." In my HarperCollins Bible commentary, biblical commentator Dr. Oon, I think that's how you may say that name, I am not sure, writes, the black horse and rider represent famine. Pair of scales, a tool used by merchants to weigh their products, and is also used as a symbol for justice. So here is a horse that is bringing justice, specifically justice as it relates to the economics around what is necessary for life. The white horse symbolized the collapse of conquering empires, as I said. The red horse symbolized the blood red slaughter that the collapses of empires inevitably will entail. The next logical step is famine and food shortage, as these nearly inevitably come in the wake of war. As was mentioned above, scales can symbolize divine judgment, as I believe they do in part here, but their primary purpose in this passage is to indicate that this horseman has something more to teach us about unjust economies, ones that benefit the comfortable while others are suffering under that economic system. Verse 6, with all of its talk of grains cost and all of that, but don't damage the olive oil and wine. What is all this about? That line, I remember reading that in my youth. This is the kind of kid who read Revelation in his youth. It may not surprise you after some things you've learned of me. But I remember not knowing what to make of that until really the last 10 years. What's this all about? Well, those Romans living during the time of this letter's writing would have had little trouble filling in the blanks. Here we have another example of the gap of 2,000 years basically hurting us or keeping us from being able to, in first blush or without doing some digging, reading or figuring out what this may mean. But basically, those reading this at the time or hearing this read would have known these are not good prices. And perhaps you could have discerned that from context clues. So this describes a financial situation in which one is barely able to keep a family afloat, if they even can at all. Of this, Dr. Blunt writes, if John's accounting is correct, a person's entire daily wage was committed solely to food. Un sets the inflationary rate as 8 times the normal price for wheat and 5.5 times the normal value for barley. So we're talking starvation wages here, but not everyone is suffering. You remember the letters to the 7 churches in Revelations 2-3, and how some of them were written to Christians who were in communities where they could, in relative comfort, sort of wait through these calamitous times. Not everyone is suffering the results of the famines that this horse represents. Verse 6 tells us of a voice coming from the throne room amidst the 4 living creatures that we considered 2 weeks ago. I like little moments like these in Revelation where we're reminded that, hey, we're still in that throne room with all of that noise and all of that. There's a lot going on, from the glassy sea to the 24 elders. So that's where we still are. So keep that in mind as he's seeing this vision. But in that context, this voice comes from the midst of the four beasts and instructs the writer not to damage the olive oil or wine. What gives? Well, here's the historical context. Quoting Blunt again. There was a great famine during the reign of Domitian during the year CE 92. This famine likely occurred just before Revelation's writing, if not during. Of this, Dr. Brian Blunt writes, and here's the quote, wealthy Roman landowners had determined that if they devoted their lands to oil and wine rather than grain, they could build greater profits. The end result, particularly during a food shortage, was devastating. While oil and wine continued to flow in abundant quantities, wheat and barley became frighteningly scarce. To ameliorate the effects of this catastrophe and ameliorate the possibility of future ones, Domitian ordered that all the vineyards, particularly those in Asia Minor, be cut back by half. In this case, the voice of God would speak with this recent imperial action in mind. So hearers of this would be aware that they were living in tough times where they could barely scrape enough to feed their family, maybe provide enough for food, but not much else. In the whole while, they would have been aware that there were wealthy landowners who had vineyards and pressed grapes for wine and olives olives are good for food and for oil for your lamps. I mean, the application of olives it's an amazing plant. And in that context, when the barley and wheat crops were struggling, you heard what I read. And it's a historical occurrence. It corresponded with the famine. And so this is basically calling out the greed that exacerbates the suffering of the famine that the black horse and its rider symbolically bring. And I'm reminded here of the Irish potato famine. I don't know if you know this history or not, But it's called the Irish Potato Famine. It was about 12 years long, I think, more than a decade, in like the mid to late 1800s. And the thing is, it wasn't really a famine. The only crop that failed was the potato crop, and there were only 3 or 4 strains of that plant, so it failed catastrophically. And the English who ran the island and had conquered it, this was before the Republic of Ireland was established and was entirely a colony of Great Britain. They were still able to raise ample amounts of meat, beef specifically, on Ireland. And so while people were starving because they could not get enough of the poor people's food, as grain and barley represents here, the potato, very nutritious. It's also an amazing plant, but and so they were able to live off of it, and the English were perfectly willing to let them have the potatoes. But then when the crop failed, they continued to ship the beef off of the island to for sale while the people starved. And so it was a it was a manufactured human catastrophe. Now humans didn't cause the potato blight, although now with what we know about cultivation, that could have also been prevented if we had more diversity in the genetic composition of those potatoes. But the suffering, the population of Ireland today is still not caught up with what it had been before the famine. This was a terrible famine, and cultivated by conditions that humans created. That is what I'm reminded of here. That is, I think, the spirit of this verse and what's being described here. And that's just another historical example of others I'm sure I could find. Now we go to the 4th seal, the pale green horse. Verse 7 reads, "When he broke the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature call out, 'Come!' I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth." So here comes the color of death. For in the Roman world, pale green was associated with sickness, death, and dying. This horse will be the worst yet. This horse really is a climactic moment before what comes next, which is a pivotal moment. And we'll get to that with the opening of the 5th seal. But this is a pivotal moment. The rider's name is Death. He is followed by the Greek god Hades. And here he means to connect the personification of death with the equally fearful personification of Hades, so that the readers may be assured that the peril now confronting them in the narrative is total. It's taken every concept that you could have culturally of death and suffering and put them all in one character. Death with Hades following. So to keep the record straight, to keep our minds where we're at in this chapter, which does have a flow and a rationale to its order, we've gone from one symbol of conquering empires being conquered themselves, that's the white horse, to a symbol of war making, violent peoples having their violence turned back on them, the red horse, to a symbol of corresponding famines that come in the wake of such war making, the black horse. And now we arrive at the inevitable end of humanity's sins, should they go unchecked, our deaths. Humans will conquer, create a new enemies. We will maintain a false peace made possible by violent interventions. And as humanity struggles through the intermittent famines that result from humanity's actions, some of us continue to feast on the finer things of life while others starve. The result of all this is death. Death for those killed, death for the killers, death for the poor, and ultimately death for the rich alike. And in an age of nuclear bombs and the ruination of our planet Earth, our fear of this pale green horse should be very acute. I'm speaking metaphorically here in regards to the horse and its rider, which is how I believe readers are meant to take him. But the death he represents is facing our human race in new ways that echo the old. And if that takes your breath away, it also probably caught the original readers aback. And now they may be wondering, okay, it seems that we are facing and will continue to face suffering, especially Christians, for the sake of the vision Jesus brought into the earth for the human race. So is it all worth it? Well, the breaking of the 5th seal is meant to teach those living that it is. We'll just read it and we'll get to that. Verse 9. When he broke the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood with the inhabitants of the earth, on the inhabitants of the earth? They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number would be complete, both of their fellow servants and their brothers and sisters who were soon to be killed as they themselves had been killed. Soul here, it implies the force that animates them. So this is something more than body. And remember, these are people whose bodies had been put to death by the Roman Empire for the word of God, which also is secondhand for Jesus. In the Israel temple, there were two altars. So let's talk about this altar. I like this picture over here by the right, on the right, by the way. I think really does convey the image in that we are meant to see, I think, who knows how many number of personages in a very tight, confined space. So there, but again, it's the symbology, not the comfort that matters here, as we'll see, because sacrifices in Israel, in the Israel temple, there were two altars. And I should have said long before, I may have touched on this a few times, the heavenly throne room and much that is there is meant to reveal and meant to reflect the temple in Jerusalem, the ordering of the temple in Jerusalem and the setup. Only it's the perfected version, the heavenly version, the complete, the whole version. That's the idea. And so you have two altars in the Israel temple. And so here we have another altar. Which altar do we mean here? One of the altars would be for sacrifices, and the other would be in the inner sanctum or the Holy of Holies. The one that's in the outer area where other people could bring their sacrifices. And the altar pictured in this scene spelled wrong by me there, forgive me, is more akin to the sacrificial altar, where in Leviticus 4:7 we read that the blood of the sacrificial bulls was placed at the base of this altar. Now the souls of the saints, poured out as the blood when they were executed for their faithfulness, cries out for justice. It is as much to say, will our deaths be in vain? Did we die for nothing? And whenever a martyr dies, I think there are people who maybe would answer that question in two different ways. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer was killed, I wonder if some of his family members thought that it was a pointless death with no meaning. Many of us make meaning of his death, and we'll have that conversation with him someday, perhaps, to see what meaning he made. But this question is, did we die for the cause in vain? When Rome kills your body, is it over? And have they won? And their passionate cry of how long reminded the early Christians of the line of prophets, the line that prophets also cried out to God, how long? Many times in the Psalms and Isaiah. We still cry this today. In fact, I have been crying this from the depths of my heart quite a lot lately. In answer to their pleas for justice, they are given a white robe and told to rest a bit longer until the number would be complete. Now, that's a bad translation. I feel comfortable even saying bad translation after what I have read today, because there seems to be a consistency amongst Greek-speaking commentators that this is another one of those sentences in John's Greek in the book of Revelation. You may remember at the beginning, I said John used a very unique and idiosyncratic Greek. Here is a moment where that comes out, because the word number is not found in the Greek here in this verse. A more literal translation may read, first the brothers and sisters must be fulfilled before first, where in the answer it says that I'm losing my spot here, where it says until the number would be complete. A better translation would be until the number would be fulfilled, which is an important point to make, because some people really get caught up on this number and they think that there's some sort of finite numbers. If God was sort of ticker counting up, that seems arbitrary. In fact, what seems to be indicated here is that while the time has not yet arrived and there will still be suffering for the cause, the suffering has boundaries. It will not go on forever. The suffering of the saints will find a terminal point, a completion. God will end it. In the meantime, the saints who have died are given brilliant white robes, festive garments of joy, freedom, and even royal status. This again, misspelling of seen, is meant to encourage Christians still living to be willing to face suffering if it's the right thing for us to do. While knowing that even should we face the worst, God sees that we experience the rewards of our suffering. Sixth seal broken, and the sky falls. Verse 12, when he broke the sixth seal, I looked, and there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished, like a scroll rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. These verses are using stock apocalyptic language. You've probably encountered similar phrases before in some of the Old Testament prophets. And if these words sound familiar, they should. Jesus used the same words to describe the transition between the older order of things and God's coming realm. You can see similar sayings in Matthew chapter 24. In John's vision, the suffering and evil baked into human existence is so entrenched that its final eradication will be raucous and a violent affair. And that's what all of this imagery is meant to convey. No one really knows how the world will end, the literal nuts and bolts of how it will go down. But this vision is meant to convey the intensity of that moment. When God will end evil, it will be a top-down affair. No stone left unturned. From the cosmos to the very depths of the earth, God will restore and bring justice. Even as the world collapses as a result of humanity's violence and greed, God will not let these destructive forces win the day. Here again is the point of the martyrs and their white robes we just read about. Even should these destructive forces take our lives, we keep our souls. Living saints are meant to take heart at this. Then verses 15 through 17 in the conclusion of this chapter. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who is able to stand? Now, this day of wrath in Hebrew apocalyptic tradition is the day of judgment, where God will fairly make an account and restore and judge. And here we see all manner of humans of every class, the rich and the poor, the slave and the free alike, and they're fleeing God's judgment. And why shouldn't they? I suppose I would too. But now those who had deceived themselves into thinking they could maintain their positions by way of their influence, power, and wealth have discovered that God's justice is truly equitable. There is no two-tier justice system. From God's vantage point, we will all, in one way or another, face the music. And that is the discovery of those who hide under the mountains, as we read the kings of the earth, right there with the slave and the free, all in the same boat. Some final thoughts, and we'll move on to some of your reflections. John wrote a letter to first century Christians throughout the eastern parts of the Roman Empire to help them not only better understand the times in which they lived, but to give them hope amidst the seemingly meaningless violence and suffering that surrounded them. We too should read this book through a similar lens. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they are called, represent forces still unleashed on our world today. Conquering leaders cause great suffering and are then conquered in turn. Violence permeates the lives of God's children across the globe. Famine and hunger are on the rise globally, most of which has been caused by human action. White horse, red horse, black horse, green horse? Maybe not. This point will be made still clear in a later lesson, but one of the primary reasons John wrote this letter was to warn complacent Christians away from these ways. We may not need to see much of the green horse or his riders as we have of late. If humans repent of death-dealing ways and turn to the life-giving ways of God, then much death and suffering will be averted. The green horse kept at bay, and maybe the other horses too. John saw that there were many Christians in the Roman Empire who saw nothing wrong with the order of things, as they had been provided with a comfortable life. John wants them to sit uneasy in their comfort so that they too will resist the forces that cause human suffering around us. I think that John may have had me in mind. I am afraid. I, Heath Jones, am afraid. But after the opening of the fifth seal, we are assured that even while we wait, even should we lose our physical lives for living faithfully in hard times, we will not have died in vain. God sees our suffering, knows our motives, and will ensure that our efforts will not have been in vain. Our white robes may be waiting. In the meantime, don't give up. What happened after the sixth seal was opened should serve as a warning to the powerful who believe that they will be able to insulate themselves from the suffering of humanity. The wealthiest people on the planet have been known to build hidden island fortresses and bunkers with a mind to wait out the end of the world in safety. The final verses of chapter 6 are meant to dispel them of that notion. Justice and just rewards will find us all, no matter our station in life. I decided to put the reading list ahead of the question section because I sometimes forget. I just want you to know the primary sources. I have not included my online sources today because I ran out of time, and I should have. But my primary sources have been commentary by Brian K. Blunt, commentary by Leonard Thompson, and also commentary by Craig R. Koester that for today's lesson. I didn't really consult from every people and nation or from Left Behind what the Bible really says about the end times. But those will be books that we'll consult later. And now I bring it back to questions. Let me close the screen and bring you back. And you may unmute yourselves at your discretion and your thoughts.
I take it in your bibliography efforts, Left Behind, what the Bible really says was a response to the first Left Behind book. I can't remember the name of the author.
Yes. That is right. Well, that will be a book, that will be a primary source for an entire lesson later, where we'll go over the history of the development of what is known as dispensationalist theology, how it began in the late 1800s, after really centuries of different ways of approaching Revelation, but mostly through a similar lens to what I'm bringing, which is an understanding that the symbolism was meant for the original audience, but we can find corollaries and parallels in our own times, and the ways of humans bring about the similar calamities in seemingly cyclical fashion. And we can find in this hope that even our own suffering will pass and God will hold us in the end. And there is a terminus. We have, as people of faith, we believe in a terminus to the suffering, an end, that when all that can be rectified and saved has been and will be, then that's the Christian hope. And that's been a primary, that's been why Revelation had been seen as a book that gave people hope through tumultuous times, up until really the most recent centuries, where it's become a book that either has empowered people to claim knowledge that they really can't know, or has terrified people into wondering if the violence in here is meant for them. Nancy, I almost included a portion from a lecture I watched on Revelation where the professor, it's the DVD series I keep, Koester, said that, Craig Koester said that, some people really, really love these word pictures and these symbols, and others say, why didn't he just write it straight? That's what he said. He literally said that.
That's what I asked last week.
That's literally what you asked. And his answer was because pictures like these, powerful pictures and symbols, not only hit us in the head as we interpret them and discover their meaning, but hit us in the heart as they convey the gravitas and the ethos and the powerful emotion and the I don't know what word I'm looking for. What word would you give? What word would you give the scene in the last verses of chapter 6, where you have the sky being rolled back like a scroll, and you have the earthquakes, and you have
it's scary.
Yeah, but it's meant to say, what's wrong with the world is so deeply baked into it that its extraction will be a very confusing and calamitous affair. As things do shake out in the wake of wars, in microcosm, we're talking global, we're talking, in a cosmic scale here in Revelation, but in microcosm, I see that truth play out.
Well, there's certainly a lot of slaughter going on at the moment around the world.
I feel like we've had a bunch of emperors on their white horses come to face with their delusions, and now we've got red horses running amok. Sorry, Jack, can't hear you.
As each seal is opened, it says, like when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Who is meant to be the living creature?
That's the second of those four that we read about in chapter 4. There's 4 living creatures, one at the head of an eagle, an ox, a human, and a lion. And Sue, I looked that up, what you asked me about, if those faces represented 4 faces of Christ. I couldn't find any. You have to send me where you found that, because I'd be interested, because I couldn't find that. I did find a lot of people saying that in time they began to associate those 4 faces and those 4 cherubs with the 4 points of the compass, which would indicate the totality of God's vision for the human race, the whole scope of the earth, but more often than not representing the 4 authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Your guys' sound isn't working, Sue. It doesn't show that you're muted, but I'm not hearing you.
But the different Gospels, I think it's Mark that portrays Jesus as the suffering servant, and then John is the glory, and Matthew is the king, I believe, and the eagle. No, the eagle's the glory. Man, servant. Oh, what's the 4th one? I've forgotten. But anyway, it comes from that.
Okay. Well, I've heard those attributes ascribed to Jesus. I just never heard them tied to those animals. But all of the things in the throne room are meant to reflect the glory of God. And so if that reveals something of Christ's nature, by how humans view those kinds of animals, then I think I could see that as a paragraph amongst 4 or 5 plausible explanations, none of them ruling one another out. There
are many things in the Bible that, because we're different, when we look at it, we get different meanings from them.
Yeah.
And God may have a totally different opinion altogether.
I'm sure God does have many different opinions.
He's probably going, "No, you haven't got it yet."
One question I have about this, and I'll just share it honestly here, just in candid transparency. This book terrified me growing up. I've not made any secret of that. And I have had a lot of healing as I have re-engaged it and found what for me were new ways of interpreting it, but what I have since found have been actually old ways of interpreting it, and the ones that aren't really the product of modern biblical scholarship, but more of a rediscovery of many things. And that at the same time, there are other commentaries that hold other paradigms that may not be right in with dispensationalist theology, but are also troubling to my theology. Now, my theology isn't God's final end, but it's just my best efforts to understand God from where I'm at right now. And so I'm having trouble discerning how much of my own axe to grind is weaving in these lessons as I'm still, trying to come into better relation with this book from my youth. So I do admit that I am presenting one of other translations, but I really do believe I don't believe that I'm what's the word? Sometimes I've been aware as a preacher where I was probably trying to see what I wanted. And I hope I'm not doing.
We see what we know.
We see what we know as well.
We are all only a product of our environment and the way we've been educated or been exposed to the word. That's the way we understand it because that's all we've been told. Unless the spirit comes in and knocks us on the head.
Well, I think the Spirit has led me through quite a lot and is continuing to lead me. Mm. And this is part of that journey, along with other things I've talked about that I won't bring up now because we're recording this. But you as my congregants and my friends and church family know some of what I've gone through this past year. And you're right, Sue. A lot of that is the unwinding of how we were brought up.
I miss the significance of the idea of the scroll.
Well,
we
talked about that
seal
last week, but we didn't spend a long time about it.
Yeah.
I was kind of annoyed at how much time the biblical commentators spent. More than one. I read all three. Said that they spent a long time trying to say, okay, is this a scroll like you roll up, or is this a book like you might open? Like, I was like, who cares? I don't know why they thought that was. They spent like 3 paragraphs on that. Some of them. It's meant to be a scroll, and the important like you'd roll up, and the important thing is the seal has the print of the one who can rightfully open it. Only the proper person with the right power and authority may open it. And inside the scroll is contained God's revelation or apocalypse, or in this case, these series of visions, I suppose, to help the people see the truth of their current circumstance and the truth about what God will do for them through it. So that's what's in the scroll. And the seals are 7, symbol of completion. So this is these seals are sealing up the totality of God's deliverance of the human race from evil. And the significance of the seals and the Lamb's singular ability to open them is it gives Jesus the authority over even the disclosure of God's designs, which puts him miles ahead of the emperor, who also had seals that he would, an imperial seal and send it across the way, with his own message and his own priorities. And here is one that the emperor couldn't open if he tried. And inside is the description of his hubris, the results of his hubris, the what comes from the death-dealing ways that humanity has practiced in patterns. And they killed Jesus in opposition as he is supposed to. And yet Jesus is the king in this book of Revelation, and can open that scroll in the face of Roman dominance.
The way I've heard it explained to me of how it works is that in the Roman time, when they had a will, they would write on, and then the seal, the person that could open it was on the outside of the will, and only that person could open it. They were the only ones that had the authority to open it. So if we think of it as a legal document, as a will would be, to me that made a little more sense as to what was going on. That just wasn't just anybody that could open it up. You had to be the chosen person to do it.
Mm-hmm. It was the penultimate moment where you had the throne room described in ways that outrivaled the other throne rooms of any kingdom. Let's just take Rome aside and just say any kingdom, whatever throne room, this throne room, from the vantage point of those reading it, indescribably grandiose. And then in the next chapter, you have Jesus, and then you have at the end of that, the heavenly host singing praises to God on that throne, giving the adulation to God that the host of the governing officials or rulers, their attendants, they would also lavish similar praises on the royal. And in this way, it's basically saying God is God, not Caesar. And then in chapter 5, Jesus, over the course of that chapter, the lamb, the lion at first, and then the slaughtered lamb, but still on his 2 feet, is elevated in status to the point where he is the sole one worthy to open that scroll, as you were saying, Sue. So that the print, the marks on those seals must have matched his identity, because he's the only one who could. And that moment, the heavenly hosts sing comparable praises to Jesus, which elevates him to the same status as he's at the right hand of the Father. And again, this, as I began by saying, the significance of those seals and all that's tied in is to just making sure in the minds of the reader and the hearers that Jesus has authority upon authority upon authority, wields it differently than the authorities we know on this earth, which is good news. But it has, ultimately, there's nothing that any human agency can do to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, the good news is the church is going to be gone before all this happens.
Well, will it? That's a question that we'll get to.
That was what the knee-jerk reaction of everyone of our ilk is to take this as prophecy and not a sermon.
Yeah.
I think the Empire of Alexander is the best example. You have the charismatic leader who everyone follows, but when he dies,
Mm-hmm.
then you have, or the charismatic leader who tries to come in and wrest control, followed by partisan rebellion, whether it's the Jewish rebellion against the Romans or the Yugoslavian rebellions against the Nazis. Followed by that makes goods and services expensive because of the wars and rumors of wars, and using the economy as a weapon to either try to wrest control of your homeland from the foreign conqueror or to maintain control of the land you've conquered. That is then followed up by death. So that pattern has repeated itself from the Chaldeans through the Second World War, and arguably on local cases even since then. So, those 4 horsemen are not new and are not creatures of the future, but are a representation of a cycle. Because as soon as because after the last horseman comes through, it's time for another horseman, another conqueror horseman to come through and go, oh, these people are ripe to be conquered because they've just lost a whole bunch of their population.
You're saying this is just showing a cycle. It's not prophecy.
Well, so prophecy in our time has come to mean telling the future. In the biblical world, it did mean describing the landscape and describing where you believe it is headed by the inspiration of God. But it is not fortune telling. It is truth telling. And it might be truth about the near certain future, should the people never change their ways. Or near truth about the near certain future because you know the people aren't going to change their ways. Or near truth about the future because you know humanity and you know that these patterns will continue to repeat and they won't change their ways. Maybe you pick up the book Isaiah and 2 centuries after its writing and you find new meaning in it then. And that's that in the biblical world, that is how prophecy has primarily functioned. Telling the truth, naming the sins, naming the injustices, naming the hope. And so it's a shame, really, that the word has become synonymous with fortune telling and future telling. But that has been the way that people have approached the book since the late 1800s, first in smaller numbers, and now in North America, probably the majority of Protestants do.
But I mean, the book itself is a letter to the seven churches.
It is a letter to the seven churches in Rome.
Yeah. So the cycle of the horsemen and of people struggling in the system. I mean, throughout the literature, there's the Wheel of Time, or in Game of Thrones, Daenerys talking about I'll break the wheel, the repeated cycle of conquering and suffering and conquering and suffering and conquering and suffering. That it's throughout history and throughout literature, and everyone thinks they're going to be the one who's the one who breaks it and doesn't, and it's just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. So when you look at the book as, for lack of a better term in our society, a sermon to the seven churches, this is the stuff I think John is putting out there to say, these are the things that apply to all seven of you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe indirectly to all human beings for all time. But yeah.
And in that way, it is prophetic and is about the future. Right. Not that it foretells the future in clear and concise detail, but it describes these patterns. And the people living in the first century did believe that they were the final generation.
Or that the riders of the horses represent specific historical and or future historical individuals instead of representing the ideas of what they are.
That will be.
And what are you going to do when you get to the new heaven?
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. No.
We'll get there. I love how this is rolling out, and
but I just wanted to say about the prophecy. All of the Old Testament's prophecies came true. This is not fortune telling or whatever you want to call it. This is God's word coming true. And because of what happened in the Old Testament, I personally believe it's going to happen from the New Testament. Because God said it.
If you are watching this online, because by the way, the last one got, last I checked, 40 views, and I've run into people who watch it, but if you watch this online, I want you to notice that you have in this space two people, Sue and I, who we both know this as a given. We love each other deeply. It's the truth. And we came into this also knowing we had different approaches to the book. and this is exactly this the kind of environment we're wanting to create. We both care deeply about this. We all, I hope, will end at the end feel that this is an important. The book is important. I think each of us will hold it differently, but it's wonderful that we can
each state our opinion and go on.
Sue, I will leave this in for people to see as a testimony, as a witness. But when I first met you, because of my background, whenever I meet somebody, my guards would go up because I was used to having to protect my heart against people who would judge me harshly. And what I learned through you is that there are people who can hold opinions that previously had been held by people that, troubled me in various ways. But you love. And in that, it's been good for me to have that experience with this book of Revelation and topics of prophecy and all these things that we go through.
God's made us all different and put us here for different reasons.
Yes. Next week, we'll see you the same time, virtually or in person, at 7:00. Peace.